Hello and welcome to News Desk. I'm Ganesh Banerjee.
And I'm Pablo Folilias.
Now, Donald Trump is upset with India. It would appear for two reasons: a trade deficit and for India's oil purchases from Russia. And so he's threatened India with tariffs in excess of 25% and penalties as well for that oil trading. But does he have a point? And can the US even dictate trade terms to India? It's what we're discussing today on News Desk.
And making this discussion possible is Dustin Hemmerlein, our producer, whom you don't see, but who is currently with the technical team producing this stream in the control room. And, of course, we have the great Cherry Chan here in the studio, and she'll be in the chat talking to you guys and helping me with some of your questions and comments. And later we'll also have two experts to discuss the economic and geopolitical aspects of this story. But back to Cherry, who has a question for all of you.
I do have a question. We have a poll question this week, like every week. And so this week we are asking, should India continue buying oil from Russia? There are four options. Yes, for its national interest. Yes, Western nations do the same. No, to show support for Ukraine, or no, to secure US trade deals. So don't forget to vote, and I will tell you the result later in our discussion.
So as Cherry was saying, do write in and send us your questions and comments. And of course, Cherry will be making sure to bring us all of that. And also I'll be bringing your comments in as much as I can throughout the chat. And we've already had some comments come in over the past 24 hours in particular. Let India put 100% tariffs on revenues earned by big tech from India. That's for our viewers, Yoho DP8PS. Then we have another comment here from Dan Velter. Great Americans can now pay much higher prices on the generic prescription medications that come from India. We'll get some more information on that, I think, in the show, what exactly he's talking about there. And another user who said, go India. He's a bully that needs to be put in his place. We're assuming he's talking about Donald Trump there. You have friends around the world, India. Start making calls and putting a plan together. The world has had enough of King Trump. And one final one here from Mango. 25% tariffs aren't enough. Impose 50% like Brazil. So there you go. Plenty of comments there, different points of view on this topic. And like I said, please do send them in to us, and we'll bring them in throughout the discussion today.
And that's the whole point, trying to bring in different points of view and different kinds of comments and suggestions and lines of thinking.
Absolutely.
That people have. That's what sort of makes this discussion worth having. So thanks for that, Pablo. Now, when it comes to Donald Trump and the tariff, there's always a moving story. So I just figured it might be a good idea to have a bit of a recap, not just for us, but for the community as well, to just see where we are and how we ended up here. Now, all of this began, well, it began a long time back, but the immediate trigger for all of this is what Donald Trump said last week, in which he basically posted on his social media platform, Truth Social, and he said that he was going to impose 25% tariffs on India and unspecified penalties because India trades with Russia for its oil. Now, this was on the 30th of July last week, which was a Wednesday, if I'm not wrong, and that was just ahead of a then August 1 deadline when reciprocal tariffs against other countries were set to come into force. So this 25% was announced by Donald Trump and was supposed to go into effect on the 1st of August. We now know that's not the case. That's been postponed to the 7th of August. That's Thursday, so a day after this discussion goes out. But anyhow, that 25% announcement came as a bit of a shock to India because India and the United States were already in the midst of negotiating a trade deal. In fact, both sides had met, I think, about 5 times from the start of this year. And in fact, US negotiators are expected in India later this month. So those negotiations were already happening, but then this tariff announcement was made by Donald Trump. But still, you had India keeping calm, keeping a cool face. And after much consideration, the Commerce Ministry from India issued a statement saying that they are studying the implications of these tariffs. That was that. Until the next post by Donald Trump, in which he referenced India and Russia rather cynically as being dead economies and saying that he doesn't really care what happens to these economies. Now, the moment he called India a dead economy, remember, it's one of the top 5 economies in the world, called India a dead economy, that raised a storm of protest as well in India. And there were lots of questions being asked as to what the relationship between India and the US has come to, particularly the personal relationship between Narendra Modi and Donald Trump. And I think we have some visuals of that, just so you have a bit of an idea. You know, the pair have met each other since the time Donald Trump was president in his first term. And they've had this personal chemistry, this personal bonhomie. Some would say a very physical chemistry in which Narendra Modi has hugged Donald Trump a number of times. I think we'll see a hug again. Will we see a hug? We do see a hug. There you go. There's the hug. So they've had these number of events that they've held together in America and in India. So the idea was that you had a US and India partnership that is strategic in nature, that exists already, but you also have two leaders of countries that have this great personal rapport. So everybody in India, at least in a lot of quarters in India, were asking the question, what happened to this? What did this lead to? If this brings us 25% tariffs and more, what is the point of this bonhomie? So those were some of the questions that were being raised, and potentially we can raise them here as well in the discussion and sort of discuss them with our experts. But that was that. And then you had on Monday, at the start of this week, this post from Donald Trump. And it's just, I think, Pablo, you have that post
got it here
ready, and we can sort of bring that up on the screen so people can just sort of follow along. So this was Donald Trump posting again, saying that because India continues to purchase oil from Russia at a time that Ukrainians are being killed by the so-called Russian war machine. Because of this, India needs to pay a penalty, and the tariffs will be substantially higher than 25%. He didn't specify how much higher than 25%, but certainly higher than 25%, linking the issue of tariffs and Russian and Indian purchases of Russian oil in the same breath. Now, this really set the cat amongst the pigeons in India, and there was a storm of protest and people demanding an extremely strong response from India. And you had the Indian External Affairs Ministry issuing a statement rather soon, and that was the statement right there.
There it is.
And if you see it, it has these, I think it's about a total of 5 points. I don't know if you can scroll up, Pablo. It had basically, there you go, 5 to 6 points. And they were all basically making the point that the targeting of India, it called it the targeting of India, I'm sorry, is, quote, unjustified and unreasonable, and also making the point that the EU, that's the European Union, and the United States both continue to trade with Russia. The EU also purchases energy, and the United States purchases uranium for nuclear power plants. So that is what the Indian External Affairs Ministry said, and basically alluding to the whole point of hypocrisy, something that the Indian government has talked about earlier as well. Why is it a problem when India trades with Russia when the US and the EU, Western nations, do the same? So that is another question that we can discuss in this discussion. So that was the response from the Indian Foreign Ministry. And then, because the story just keeps continuing and there's always developments in there, on Tuesday, a journalist asked Donald Trump about US trade with Russia. And we have a clip of that exchange, and it's just worth seeing how that exchange went.
India says that the US imports Russian uranium, chemicals, fertilizers, while criticizing their energy imports. Your response to that, sir?
I don't know anything about it. I'd have to check, but we'll get back to you on that. Yeah, please. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Right, so we're still waiting for Donald Trump to get back to us. Maybe not us, but at least journalists around the world on that. We'll get back to you. We're waiting. We still haven't had this. This discussion goes out on a Wednesday. We don't know what it's going to be like till Thursday because things change and this thing remains as an on-demand. But yeah, just so you've heard it, at this point, we do not know what that response from the United States is. But as of Wednesday, while we're having this live discussion. But that's what we had. I don't know if that made sense, Pablo. Maybe I was talking really fast. But do we have any comments? I don't know. I wasn't looking at the chat. But,
we do. We have some comments. I mean, there's one from our one of our regular viewers, Untitled Chapter, saying India can and should strike back. Trump and the US are not aiming for partnerships, but coveting vassalage. US seeks to have a veto over Indian foreign policy and national political aims. India should resist. And then, of course, we have another commenter, different, like we said, they're very strong opinions in this week's chat. Alexander Gali, we need nothing from India. Walmart needs cheap cotton. We could live without junk from India and China. I would rather pay $10 for better quality than longer lasting anyway. So two fairly kind of strong comments there. Then we have another one here from Virmati Devi. Will these tariffs affect the India-US relations in the long term, or all this mess by Trump, will it get wiped out with the next US president? And that's one actually that seems to come up quite a lot.
Yeah, and we do intend to discuss that with our experts. Just by the way, I mean, thanks so much for those comments. Let's try and keep a bit of decorum. I know that tempers can get frayed quite quickly, but then the whole idea behind this discussion is to bring in what is a subject, a hard subject, and to bring in the comments thereof into this discussion. So let's just, without further ado, we promised you two experts. Let's bring in those two experts joining us from India. We have Professor Swasti Rao, who is an associate professor at the O.P. Jindal Global University and also a consulting editor in international and strategic affairs at The Print. For those of you who do not know it, outside of India, The Print is a news portal highly respected in India. Welcome, Swasti. Thanks so much for making the time. We also have Rahul Ahluwalia. He's director of the Foundation for Economic Development. Now, this is an organization that works with a number of state governments in India, trying to work on Indian economic growth and Indian economic development to try and live the full potential that India promises. I hope I got that right, Rahul. And if not, you can correct me when I talk to you. But the idea behind having you, Rahul, is that you can talk to us a bit about the economic aspect of the tariffs over a trade deficit and potentially the penalties about trade with the oil trade with Russia, delve into the economic aspects of that. And Swasti, if you can talk about the geopolitical aspects of both these items. So we'll try and separate out the two. They're all connected, but let's see where we end up. So let's just start this conversation with you, Swasti. Donald Trump was talking about India purchasing Russian oil at a time that a war is on. He's not the first person who's bringing this point up. But then, I mean, is it not difficult for India to convince others that at a moral level, India is purchasing oil from a nation that began a war with a sovereign nation and continues to kill Ukrainian citizens on a daily basis? India continues to purchase oil from that country. I mean, how does India justify that?
For having me, Biresh. It's a pleasure to join both you and Pablo. As for your question on how does India do it, this entire discussion on Donald Trump's modus operandi on singling India out and sort of using a kind of a very unbecoming language for India, that has stirred a lot of emotions. And as a result, what has started to happen is that this discussion has ceased to operate in the space of rationality, and it has completely taken over a very different jingoistic, angry kind of a reaction. And I obviously understand why, but actually that doesn't really help. So very quickly to your question on how India manages it. Now, in my own opinion, and I've been working on the war in Ukraine, and I work on European geopolitics and India's foreign policy with that region. In my own, opinion, I would perhaps say that what really rubs perhaps the Western bloc the wrong way is not just India's purchases of Russian oil, because our MEA was quick to point out that it is the United States as well as European Union that continue having business relations with Russia. So nobody is arguing that it is easy for them to substitute their 4-decade dependence on Russia in a jiffy or overnight. As far as I know, the European Union plans to phase that out, the remaining dependence, by 2027. Now, in India, it is usually taken on in isolation, behaving as if it is just this particular trade which is a problem. I think the problem runs deeper, which is that India has done nothing, literally, to even slightly condemn a flagrant violation of international law, which is very obvious, citing historical ties with Russia. My opinion has been that our ties on Russia stand on their own, but it doesn't stop India from playing a larger role in the Russia-Ukraine war. And if you remember, until the G20 was happening in September 2023, actually India projected itself as an ideal actor in international relations to do something positive about it. But as that particular thing subsided, we saw that India did not really play any meaningful role, whether it was on prisoners of war exchange, whether it was on getting children back to Ukraine, whether it was on humanitarian assistance, and all of that kind of just stopped right there. So I think the anger that you see sometimes in the Western Bloc, which perhaps India also needs to understand better, is coming not only from these purchases, of course, but there is a context to that. And very quickly on your on the second part, I think it is also, I think West has to sort of understand that just how important India's geopolitical vulnerability is right away in South Asia, in the current moment, just as we have faced, something called an Operation Sindoor from Pakistan and China helping Pakistan to the extent that it did. And obviously, we were looking forward to having a trade deal with the United States. We are also close to finalizing one with the European Union. We just had one with the UK. So in the larger strategic calculus of Prime Minister Modi, prioritizing security ties and economic ties have been pretty much, an objective. And in the midst of that, when you see Donald Trump, the president of the United States, using that kind of language, which is unbecoming of any statesman, and really sort of taking credit for, the ceasefire between India and Pakistan, which of course India has a different view on, it really doesn't go down well. And then the entire drama that is unfolded.
A lot of context there, Swasti. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Let me just pick on one part of it. Yeah, you were talking about dependence. Yeah, you were talking about when it comes to the Europeans, the European Union, and Russian oil and gas. You were talking about a 40-year dependence. India did not have a dependence when it came to Russian oil, because if you look at India's oil imports around 2022, before the war began, I think the entire mix, Russian oil, was barely 0.2%. And in 2024, if I'm not wrong, it reached about 40%. Somewhere right now, it is somewhere below 40%. So you're looking at a case of India not being dependent on Russian oil, but the Europeans, and you can argue whether it was a strategic, it made strategic sense to be dependent on Russian oil and gas. The Europeans were dependent for 40 years. But since 2022, that dependence on Russian gas, for example, has gone down from something like 45% to currently at about 19%. So Europe has reduced its dependence from 4 decades within a matter of 3 years. But in 3 years, India has gone up from 0.2% to somewhere around 40%. How do you explain that then?
No, that's a very important point, because it is something that is not acknowledged in India, that while we are very quick to offer these trade figures, we don't really sort of put that in context, saying that it is also the same actors that have spent billions and billions of dollars in supporting Ukraine, whichever way possible. Okay, so there's also another side to that story. That's one. The other thing, you're right. I agree. And I think that there is a serious lack of understanding of how the geopolitics of the region has panned out that really stops India from having a more objective analysis. I mean, we were not dependent on Russian oil at all. Our traditional, traditional sources for oil imports have been all from the Middle East, and we've been, happily getting our oil from there. If I can just tell you some figures that will help the viewers understand what exactly is India's dependence. So India requires 5 to 5.5 million barrels per day of crude oil. And out of that, about 88% is imported. The rest of it is domestic production. We've been trying to ramp up our domestic production, but it has not been able to increase. And therefore, our dependence on imports have only increased. So 88% of that 5.5 million comes from about 4.8 million barrels per day. That we require. And out of that, as you rightly said, that before the Russian war in Ukraine, we were hardly getting 1%, hardly, barely 1%. Yep. And now that's close to 35%, on an average. You mentioned 40 and then it came down. Now, the very reason why we started buying from Russia was not because of our dependence. We started buying oil from Russia because we were getting it cheap. And the simple question to then ask is, why were we getting it cheaper? We were getting it cheaper because of the price cap, which was imposed by the G7. That's one. Now, when we get into these details of, how much money has India really been able to save, or let's say spent less when it comes to buying the discounted Russian oil, actually the data is very problematic, because if you were to go and really try and find as to what have been the real volumes and at what price have they traded, you will not get a uniform understanding of how the discounts have been. So we know that after 2022 December, which was when the price cap came into effect, I think 5th December 2022, you do see that in the immediate aftermath of that particular date, there was a higher discount offered, which also makes sense because Russia also wanted to lure, other economies into buying their oil. That's one. And then that was also the time when the United States, etc., were happy that India was buying the oil because they wanted to keep the global, sort of supply as stable as possible and the prices as stable as possible. That's precisely the objective of the price cap. Now, after that, we do not know if we were getting the same discounts, number one. Initially, when this entire thing was offered to us, we were also getting it on FOB basis, which means free on board basis. Yeah. But we do not know if the free on board basis was maintained in the last 2 years. So what I mean to say, without getting into too many technicalities, is that when you sort of try and get into the nitty gritty of this oil trade, there are certain issues which require more clarity. One is that what really has been the discounts that India has gotten. Of course, we know that China gets better discounts, but we have no information on that. It's all in the realm of speculation. Neither party would come out with figures. Yeah. Number two is that how have we been actually paying for it? Because as you know, that India has had problems with rupee-ruble trade. Yeah. We cannot pay in the US dollars. Initially, we were paying in dirhams, but also there is a limit to that because, from where are we going to get the dirhams? If you look at our trade with the UAE, we are in an export deficit there again. So what I'm saying is that if it is happening, we don't want to pay in yuan, even though there are reports that we have paid some for some of those purchases in yuan because we do not want to get into the yuanization of all this de-dollarized trade.
Quickly, you know so much, and there's so much of detail that you can provide, but just for the sake of our viewers and for my own mental understanding, can you just keep it, I don't know, just for the sake of brevity, because there's a lot more that we want to discuss. And sorry, I don't mean to sort of shut you up or anything. It's just because we want to take in different aspects of it. And this is where I'd like to bring in Rahul. Thanks so much for listening in patiently. I just want to take a step back. I mean, Swasti's provided an extreme amount of detail, and it's just great to be able to have that, which is why we have this format. But just, Rahul, if I can just take a step back, can you help me understand, just as an ordinary the person who's following things, these discounted purchases, no matter, even if you don't know the inner workings of it, as Swasti was saying, these discounted oil purchases, is that something that worked for the benefit of the Indian economy, A? And B, when Donald Trump says that India was selling this in the open market at a profit, does he have a point? Is he right?
So, to some extent, yes, because you have likely gotten the crude cheaper because there was a price cap imposed, but it would not have been that much cheaper than the world price, right? I think Russia could have and did find other buyers. But the open market, so for instance, the Indian refined petroleum market has just maintained the same prices. And so overall, the economy has not benefited from it as much as you would like. I think the Indian current account deficit has benefited to some extent, but the current account deficit is not actually that important a number, right? I think you pay for your imports from your exports. And as long as your exports are doing fine, which India's exports, especially its combined services and goods exports, have been doing fine, the current account deficit is not that important a number for India. So to some extent, he's right, but it's not actually an important figure.
Then let me ask you something. That the Indian government repeatedly says. It says that, and maybe Swasti also has a point on that, but first to you, Rahul. The Indian government's argument has always been, look, it is because we were purchasing this oil that global prices of oil did not shoot up. Yeah. I mean, is there something to that argument?
Absolutely, because look, there is only so much supply of oil, especially in the short run, right? If you block off a very large part of the supply of oil, it's just basic economics that the prices will go up because the supply overall will be meeting more demand. And that gives the rest of the OPEC cartel much more leverage to increase oil prices for the world. So economics 101, it applies.
Swasti, you wanted to comment on that? I thought I heard you.
Well, yeah, I will, because it's a very important point, which also, again, needs a bit of more clarity. Now, as far as saving up is concerned, the government doesn't really say much. The government only says that we need to act in strategic autonomy and we need to act in India's interests, which is like saying that the sun rises in the east. I mean, which is very, very obvious. I mean, obviously, all countries should act in their national interests. So that's
I'm glad you described it like that.
Coming back, all right, I'm glad it sort of cut ice, because that's how obvious it is. Now, very quickly, I think there are certain reports that say that India landed up saving about $25 billion from its purchases of discounted Russian oil. But when you sort of read those reports in full, they also mention that India landed up saving that money not only because the oil that we purchased was cheaper, but also because the price of oil, the crude oil, actually has been going down. And if you take the last 6 months average, you'll see that there's perhaps a 12% decline in the crude oil prices. So contrary to what everybody thought, and if you remember, I mean, OPEC Plus has also ramped up production because they want to have more market share. I mean, I'm not really an economist by training. I'm more of a strategic and defense expert, but obviously that's something that I track very, very closely. So they have increased production. So we are in a situation in the world where we have the total economic activity has been shrunk a little bit because of Donald Trump and his very uncertain tariffs and his economic policies and the knee-jerk reactions, but also because OPEC Plus has decided to actually ramp up production. And by and large, despite all the problems in the Middle East, you do see that there is in the last 6 months or so, there is a 12% decline in the oil prices. So when you go into the same reports in detail, you see that India landed up saving that money also because there was an overall decline in oil prices. Okay, so those are the things on which we do not have any data from the government side yet. And therefore, you see so much of speculation around it. Now, this is something which is by and large, if you ask me very quickly, what is happening is that in the few days after this entire drama has unfolded, one has already seen that the Indian refineries have started to diversify already. There has been a 51% increase in imports from the United States alone and from other players. And there is in proportion to that, there has been a drop from Russia. And this is not happening because the government has issued or not issued an advisory. I don't think the government is going to get into these kind of, technicalities. But the businesses would not do something which would have economic, implications. So this is something which will auto-adjust in a few months. But my real worry out there is what happens to the trade deal with the US, because that is a trading relationship which is more than $200 billion and something that is quite important to us.
And I hold that thought because I do want to talk to you about that. And I was going to sort of bring that in when we start talking about tariffs and the 25% tariffs. But this sort of leads me nicely to what I wanted to ask you, Rahul. As Swasti is saying about this automatic adjustment in prices, is it possible if this adjustment continues and OPEC producing more oil, that there is an opportunity, in a sense, for India to reduce the amount of Russian oil it purchases and buy from its traditional suppliers as it used to earlier?
I mean, yes, but not if we make a straightforward commitment that we will not purchase Russian oil, right? Okay. Again, this is how credible commitments work. If you make a worldwide commitment that you're not going to purchase Russian oil, that leaves other suppliers with the opportunity to say, let me raise prices now because they don't have any other alternative. So if you strengthen the monopoly that OPEC has, that reduces your leverage to buy from other suppliers. So it does give you that possibility, but you have to keep in mind that the decline is happening in part because India is buying Russian oil. But I also want to say that I think overall this whole oil discussion or India buying from Russia discussion is a bit of a distraction, right? And this is classic Donald Trump. You throw out distractions for what your main issues are. I don't think that Donald Trump genuinely cares about India trading with Russia. It's a nice little sort of fig leaf for him to put over the fact that the India-US trade deal is not getting struck. And the reasons for that are unknown to us, although we can take a good guess at it. But Donald Trump bringing in Russia it's a distraction. Until 2 months ago, he was saying that Vladimir Putin is a very fine gentleman, and he wanted Ukraine to take the lead in putting forward the ceasefire, right? So I don't think that this actually matters as much as we've suddenly started focusing on it just because Trump is waving a sort of, magician's distraction flag and saying, look at this reason.
No, I'm telling you, that's not the reason why we are focusing on it. But it's just, I'm glad that you brought it up because I do want to go and talk about tariffs and that trade deal. It's something that Swasti also talked about. But we just wanted to get the oil discussion going because it's not the first time it has come up. I think we can question the motivations behind that, and we do intend to. But before we do that, I think Pablo has some comments from the community.
I do. I've got plenty of comments coming. I was sitting back and letting the discussion flow because it is really fascinating listening to you, Swasti and Raul. But of course, I'm not the only one who has lots of thoughts and questions. And our viewers, we'll start with Ankit Singh, who said, Europe got its security from the US, energy from Russia, and cheap goods from China for years, and nobody cared or called them out. Now, suddenly, when India is trying to do the same, it's a problem. We have a question from Devos, one of our regular viewers, who said, who else does India buy oil from? So maybe that can be answered again. I think Swasti did actually go into a little bit of detail there about who else India gets its
Iraq
oil.
and Saudi Arabia.
Correct. And then we have another commentary from another one of our regular viewers, Carolina Villena, who says, what's the big deal for Trump if India wants to buy oil in Russia for the nation's sake? Every country won't be dependent on a single country as they need to have other alternatives and resources. Then Avadesh Sharma asks, can the US help in getting a discount from the UAE if India stops buying oil from Russia? Maybe that question can also be asked about other countries apart from the UAE. Then we have one here from another viewer who says, India exposed Western hypocrisy, both the EU and USA buying and doing trade with Russia, but they are pointing fingers at India. And another comment, and then I'll let the discussion continue, from Deodatta Deshmukh. Can emerging economies ever break free of the oil dependency trap and build truly sustainable energy systems without first shifting the burden of decarbonisation onto historic emitters? That's a nice light question there.
Just a light question.
Maybe our guests can sum up.
I don't know how much they can sum up, but you know what? I just vote for, unless Swasti, you and Rahul have something compelling you'll want to come in with, I'd just like to move it forward, the discussion forward, to talk about tariffs and that trade deal that may or may not be happening, yeah, if that's okay with everybody. So let's just move this forward, because we were talking about these tariffs. Now, Donald Trump is talking about in excess of 25% being imposed on India. And back to the point that you were making, Rahul, do you think this whole linking, the whole oil trade from Russia, with these negotiations over a trade deal is a decoy, is a tactic to try and pressure India to sign a trade deal on the US's terms, or does it mean that this trade deal is in fact dead?
No, I think the discussions are still ongoing. I think Donald Trump has proven to be a person who makes statements and is very flexible in action, right? The China example is a perfect one. He's claimed that China will have tariffs in excess of 100%. Today, China is on a tariff pause, whatever that means. And by and large, the world expects that he will arrive at some kind of compromise. And I think this is part of the same toolbox that he often employs, which is to make grand statements about something in order to help it serve his purposes. So I do think that this is one part of trying to get a better negotiation, because the negotiations seem to be stuck.
Swasti, do you think that these negotiations are stuck? And if so, what are the sticking points? What do you think?
So the trade deal did have problems on its own, even if you were to divorce it from the ongoing, controversy on India buying Russian oil. Even if we were not buying any Russian oil, it still had problems, and the problems basically emerged from the fact that, see, India and US. This is also just to give certain figures because it then helps the viewers understand the enormity of the trade, better. It's a $212 billion trade in goods and services, out of which $130 billion is merchandise, okay, which is, goods. And then out of that, $85 billion is what we export, and that lands in the United States in about $45 billion worth of deficit, okay? And this is what Donald Trump is trying to fix. Now, from Donald Trump's perspective, there have been a long-standing demand on India to open its markets, which are very, very sensitive to actually international competition. Because again, the problem sort of somewhere comes back home to us, which is that in the last 70 years of our economic journey after our independence in 1947, we have not been able to do the necessary domestic structural reforms. So our agriculture, India is largely, 70% of India is still an agriculture-based country. So agriculture and dairy remain to be very vulnerable to outside competition, and we would be in a mess if we were to open this sector, even partially. I mean, although there are certain sectors that we have been trying to discuss with the United States where they can come and it would not affect us as much. But long and short is that if there is a lot of discussion in India right now as to this kind of a pressure coming from the United States could actually be a trigger for us to really embark upon these reforms that we need to do, because this is a sticking point with almost every Western country that we want to enter into a trade deal with, like that. Now, having said that, I mean, we are expecting a team from the United States to come to India and try to sort of iron out certain areas where we can help reduce the trade deficit, because Donald Trump's major problem is the trade deficit that he runs with India. And India, to sort of assuage that concern on, in Donald Trump, we've been trying to dramatically increase the crude oil purchases, defense equipment, et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes to these two sectors, it is true that India has massive vulnerability, and our farmers and our dairy farmers will not be able to withstand the dumping of more competitive and cheaper American goods. That's one part. The second part of why this is important for us is also coming from the fact that a lot of our own competitors, like Vietnam, like Indonesia, etc., they have settled with a better tariff rates, with Donald Trump already. And what happens then is that would make our products in the United States market less competitive. Okay. And please remember that all this is happening in the wider backdrop of the fact that India has not been able to emerge as a manufacturing hub. So the more we export to the West, the more we'll end up importing from China, because we have not been able to have manufacturing rise as a percentage of the GDP. And those are the reasons why we remain very susceptible to all these changes in the global market, and the kind of situation if it goes against us. And also remember that these are markets where we enjoy a good trade surplus. So this is something that we would like to sort of keep under the best possible scenario. So just my last point is that I don't think that it's completely dead, but I do see that linking of these two situations, that India buying Russian oil on the one hand, and Donald Trump making such a much ado about it. And I honestly sort of disagree that it is coming. I mean, Donald Trump is just putting up an act and he doesn't care. I think there has been a bit of a misreading in India on what Donald Trump wants from the Russia-Ukraine war. His initial cozying up to Putin also came from the fact that he wants to be seen as somebody who is a successful mediator. He wants to end the war, and whatever strategy that he had adopted for sort of, giving all the carrots to President Putin have not worked in the first 6 months. And now also, if you remember, he has ties to mend with the Senate as well. Okay. And in the Senate, when the Lindsey Graham Blumenthal bill is being supported by an overwhelming majority.
Yeah.
So I think this is also a bit of the domestic consolidation that Donald Trump wants before the midterms, etc. He understands that there is a huge support for Ukraine, and the other thing is that he thinks that perhaps by ramping up pressure on India the way he's doing, he can perhaps walk away with some kind of a deal between Russia and Ukraine. I doubt that, but I think India also needs to understand why that has become a kind of a centerpiece, which wasn't so in the last 6 months.
Okay, thanks for that detailed analysis. Rahul, I wanted to get your view on the 25% and above. We don't know. He's talking about tariffs of more than 25%. He hasn't specified how much when it comes to tariffs for India. But just staying on the 25% figure, I mean, I was reading that there were estimations that India's GDP growth would not be hit by very much, something like 0.2%. I think the projection is for 6.6%. This year, it might come down to 6.4%. Now, that doesn't sound like very much. If that is indeed the case, why is India worried?
So there's two different parts of this, right? I think 25% we may or may not. It depends on ultimately where do we end up relative to other countries, right? So it would be worse than Vietnam. It would be slightly better than China. And overall, if we are in the approximate same bucket, it'll cause some damage. It'll especially cause damage, though, to labor-intensive, job-creating industries like apparel, like gems and jewelry. And these industries and these job losses are things that India can ill afford, right? So I think that's one reason why we have good reason to be worried. The other one is that small percentage changes in a compound growth rate can, over time, lead to very, very large changes, right? So if that 0.6 to 0.7% change is baked in over time, it can lead to very, very massive changes. And we would actually want to grow that much faster, not that much slower. It makes a huge difference. And I'd like to also just sort of reframe this a little bit, right? I think Donald Trump and his war on trade is starting from a very fundamental misunderstanding of economics, right? He's starting from this perspective that a trade deficit is a bad thing. And a trade deficit is not necessarily a bad thing at all, right? I think you and I have a 100% trade deficit with the shopkeeper near our house, but we don't worry about that, right? Because we also have a similar trade deficit with our employers who pay us. So
I never thought of it that way.
Did I?
So you've given me a good tool to try for my next tariff negotiations, but carry on. But this is great. Carry on.
Yeah. So trade happens with places where we have a complementary advantage or a complementary disadvantage, right? So we focus on the areas that are our strengths, and we trade for the areas that are our weaknesses. And that win-win combination leads us to doing well over time. Donald Trump claims that America has been hit by trade and trade deficits. America is the richest country in the world, richest large country in the world by a large distance. And a huge part of that has been trade, right? America focuses its resources in the areas where it has strengths. And for India, a large part of our wealth increase has happened when we have dropped tariffs and we have encouraged trade, right? So after 1990, when we have dropped tariffs is when trade has increased massively. And this has been the same period in which India has grown massively. So I think we shouldn't get misled into following the paradigm or allowing Donald Trump to set the paradigm for the rest of the world.
Right.
We have to engage with the US on the terms of the US, but I think the rest of the world should be very careful about not accepting that paradigm as the default paradigm. We do not have to have a trade war. Trade is, in most cases, good for all parties. I think there are some small national security exceptions, but we should take those national security exceptions and deal with them using different policy, not trade policy.
Okay, just a quick matter of logistics. Rahul, can you stay on a little bit longer? Because we know that... Yeah, okay, if that's the case.
Right. I'm just going to jump in with some of the comments from our viewers related to what's already been said by our experts. Why can't the United States and the EU see India as a mediating power between the West and Russia? What does India need to do to exercise that extent of prowess? That's from Dexter. Then we have another comment here, which is saying there might be a short-term loss to India with Trump's tariff war, but it's going to rattle the US in the long term on many fronts. Remember, India is the largest democratic sovereign nation. And then one question which over these topics of tariffs, which has come up time and time again, which is, we talk about tariffs and the percentages and whatnot, and this is from one of our viewers who says, this is all incomprehensible to me. How would it affect me if the US put tariffs on India? So maybe that's one of the questions that can be answered by our experts today.
I don't know who wants to take it.
Who wants to jump on that one? That light question.
The latter one I can take, right? So it depends on who me is. If me is somebody in the US,
me in India,
they have a certain set. Me in India, I mean, it depends on how far the tariffs and the tariff wars go, right? So if you are, if we become worse off on tariffs relative to other countries, our goods will sell less in the US. We'll have fewer jobs. We'll have more people who will depend on government welfare. Taxes could rise, right? So in general, if this person is old enough to remember what India was like before 1990, when trade was lower, that's a sort of one type of model, right? Taken to the extreme, if trade is low enough, India stays poorer for much longer than it needs to. That's the way it affects somebody in India.
And what about someone in the United States? Just because we're not sure exactly where this viewer is writing in from.
Yeah, so in the United States, and I'll just extend the India bit a little more. If the trade war becomes more extensive, if Donald Trump decides to push it beyond goods, which luckily for all of us is not under discussion right now, but if at some point it starts hitting services, right? Services export has been a mainstay of Indian growth, Indian middle-class employment, and sort of improvements in Indian standards of living. If the services trade with the US starts getting affected, it affects almost every Indian middle-class person in a very direct way, when all the previous topics that I mentioned were relatively indirect. I think for somebody living in the US, all of these tariffs will result in higher prices. It's happening already. Or you can expect things like T-shirts, you can expect things like jewelry to cost more over time as some of these tariffs come on board. And generally, a trade war is lose-lose and more trade is win-win. So there'll be very real effects that people will start seeing.
Right. Thanks for that, Rahul. I know we've extended the time that you were going to stay on for us. We're just going to thank you for your contribution at this stage. Thanks so much for joining us and making that time at short notice, because we were trying to reach out to you for that time. So, Rahul, thanks so much for your contribution.
No,
thanks for breaking that down for us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Swasti, if I can just sort of take this a little bit forward and try and look at it in terms of the bilateral ties between India and the US, how would you assess them as to where are they now, given that in India, at least, it was always, at least in the past few decades, in India, a strategic partner of the United States, and this relationship was really growing. And there appeared to be bipartisan consensus in Washington to keep India on side. Do you think that this is fraying a bit because of what Donald Trump has begun?
Yeah. So I mean, I'll just give you, certain broad parameters to sort of help everybody understand the importance of the India-US relationship, I mean, which cannot be overstated. India-US relationship is certainly one of the most significant and consequential relationships of the 21st century. There's no doubt about it. It was not like this always. There was a Cold War context when the United States sided with our arch rival Pakistan, and we had a security treaty of sorts, which was called this Treaty of Friendship, etc., with the Soviet Union. So just one thing, I think everybody understands that in the last 25 years, the India-US relationship has fundamentally transformed. But when you see somebody like Donald Trump come in, and this is a point that is important to understand, why do you see this kind of a pushback, in India? Please understand that anti-Westernism has been India's default setting, and anti-Westernism comes rather naturally to us because of the Cold War context. So even though India seems to be extremely comfortable in its strategic communication with the tyrants and despots and authoritarian rulers, you would see that often India carries, and a lot of Indians carry a lot of mistrust of liberal democracies. And this is a paradox, actually, because India is the world's largest democracy. But coming back and circling back to what is happening right now between Trump and India, there is no doubt about the fact that Donald Trump is going to go someday, and India-US ties are going to sort of, still remain. So anybody in their right minds would argue that India should stay calm and India should stay firm, and India should be, acting in India's interest. We should try and cut a deal, negotiate. And that's what we are doing. But just one thing, I think there is something that India has misread, which has been Donald Trump's fixation, if I may say, to bring wars to an end. I think there's something that India could have done really well that India did not do at all. And here I'm not referring to the Pakistan or Operation Sindoor. I genuinely am of the opinion that India could have played a more visible role in helping the Russia-Ukraine war, the suffering of it lessen a little bit. So whether it was prisoners of war, I mentioned that factor earlier, all of that was done by UAE. All the talks were hosted by Saudi Arabia and India, even though Prime Minister Modi had gone to Ukraine and met President Zelensky, and they did sign on a joint statement where certain things were promised. From India's perspective, right after the G20 summit concluded, there was absolutely nothing happening on that front. So India, that takes so much pride in being a major humanitarian actor, disaster relief actor, etc., would have done a dozen things to help the strategic, trust, to build the strategic trust while maintaining its ties with Russia. I mean, nobody really is saying that political neutrality is tantamount to sort of not playing any role. I mean, you have all these players that have played a very, very active role, and that is something where I feel that that was a missed opportunity. Now, what I have argued through my own writings is that even with Donald Trump, I'm sure these kind of things would not be discussed in public domain, but I'm sure that there is a certain step that India can take forward and say that, yes, I am in an ideal position to speak to everybody in this conflict, and let me try to do something about it in a positive enough manner, which doesn't mean bringing the war to an end, but bringing, doing something constructive and positive about it, something that India was ideally placed to do and did not do. So that was the point.
But how much power, Swastika, I need to ask you this, how much power and how much influence does India really have? I mean, you look at the China-Russia equation at the moment. I mean, India has been trying desperately to sort of balance that, particularly since the outbreak of the war. And you've had Prime Minister Modi meeting President Putin as well. I think we have some visuals of that, much to the chagrin of people here in Europe and in the West. So all these meetings and all keep happening. And I think Prime Minister Modi is now also going to be meeting Xi Jinping very soon. Those are images from last year. I think maybe, I don't know if you can see this. The question I think I'm building up to is how much influence does India really have when it's itself trying to balance its own neighborhood between Russia and China? Isn't China a bigger actor that can actually bring about an end to the war?
I mean, if you're referring to the Russia-Ukraine war, I think there is no, it's right on the wall that Russia has been pushed with China in a way which is rather irreversible in the 3.5 years of this war. And China, and actually Russia owes much of its, I would say, economic, so to say, or the fiscal, management because of Chinese help. So I think China is really somebody that can, really bring the war to an end. I think the Europeans also wanted that. Europeans were all initially, if you remember, the view was that the Europeans would try to use the leverage of their big trade with the Chinese and sort of, ask them to do something about the war. I don't think China has done anything. I only see the geostrategic, the geo-economic sort of alignment and the strategic alignment between Russia and China deepening, which is also a concern for India because I hope you also know that India, although oil trade was never on the radar for us, but India was mighty dependent on Russia for its weapons and continues to be dependent on Russia for its legacy platforms. And there's a difference, which is that there was a time when India was dependent for about 60-70% of its weapons, on the Soviet Union. And if you look at the last 5 years data alone, which is put together by SIPRI, you see that that dependence has now come down to 36%. And by the time the next 5-year data would come, this dependence would further reduce because India has not placed a single new order with Russia after the war in Ukraine has begun. The reasons being basically 2. One is that we do not know if Russia is in a position to sort of export because Russia's export base has fallen. We could see that Russia was not able to support Iran or Assad in Syria or, Armenia, Azerbaijan. I mean, we've been seeing all that. And the second thing is about because of this Russia getting dependent on China, we do not know to what extent is now, Chinese tech or Chinese equipment or information systems are now part of Russian weapons because it's cut off from Western technology. And this is something which is not discussed much because, as you can see, that the public opinion in India, of course, remains extremely pro-Russia because of a historical experience of a very stable relationship. But if you look at it from a technical perspective, of course, the Indian Ministry of Defense has been taking out advisories, at least in public domain. So there is much more happening behind closed doors, which is of, telling the Indian armed forces to cleanse the Indian equipment of Chinese tech, and especially after Operation Sindoor and the kind of technological support that we saw China extending to Pakistan. To our surprise, because I do not have any qualms in saying that we were not expecting the Chinese and the Pakistani systems to be linked optimally in a way that would become a challenge for us. And therefore, it is now all the more a subject of discussion that we do not want this quasi-dependence on China, if at all, through Russian weapons, which China can at some point weaponize against us. So these are the many nitty-gritties. But just give me a second and I'll just come back to that. I think the idea that I was trying to put forth was not that India was ideally positioned to bring the war to an end. Obviously, India doesn't have that kind of leverage. What I meant to say was that there could be n number of steps that India could have taken to actually substantiate the claim of it being, a partner that could speak, or the bridge that could sort of speak to everybody. And that is something, that conversation is something that we saw disappear completely.
But what kind of steps?
After the 2023 G20, like I said, the prisoners of war exchange, India could have, sent more humanitarian aid and assistance to Ukraine. Ukraine asked India for generators. I mean, if you get into the details, we sent them a few in the first year or second year, just around the time when Prime Minister Modi visited there. And then we brought all of that to an end. The only thing that is happening right now, which is not happening from the government side, and therefore it shouldn't really count as a government initiative or effort, is that the private companies in India have found a way to sell the 155 shells to Ukraine via third parties. But this is again something which is not on record, so to say, because then you could say that, so many of Indian companies could also be selling a dual-use equipment to Russia, again, via third parties. So when you get into that kind of a shadow trade, when you get into that kind of a shadow trade routes, it becomes very difficult to actually put it out on paper, and they don't really fall into the purview of official discussions. But officially speaking, there was a lot, even in the joint statement, as per the joint statement that could have happened. And I do see that there is a space for India to sort of step up that engagement as a humanitarian actor, as a neutral actor, because India, if you remember our External Affairs Minister's words, he said that India's neutrality is not passive, it's active. What does it mean? And it has to become a performative,
And that was one of the questions, wasn't it, that was put forward in the chat today. Swati, I just want to jump in because there's plenty of comments coming in and questions too. We have one which is, once again, has been asked, which is, there seems to be a lot of concern about how damaging this trade war would be in the long term for the India-US partnership. Considering that relations have been on the up in the past few decades. Also, then, there's another comment here, which is from Sachin Fulgol, who says, Trump often takes things personally and tends to act like the boss of the world. India should help him understand the importance of empathy and respecting differing viewpoints. Then here's another one about how India can retaliate against the United States. It's a question that's come in a few times, actually. Here's one from Abhinav Parivesh. I'm sorry for my pronunciation of the names. Can India put retaliatory tariffs on, say, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp and YouTube for all of whom India is the largest and irreplaceable market, way ahead of the United States itself. So maybe I can actually put that question to you.
Yeah.
What is the impact, or how can India perhaps retaliate? And of course, the IT sector is quite large.
Just to sort of give a kind of a general answer to many of these, viewers that seem to be very angry, and I completely understand why, because who talks like that, for God's sake, But coming back, I think if you see a situation where India is trying to go for a tactical rapprochement with an arch rival such as China, who has been trying to damage us in the worst possible manner, right? Whether it is through Pakistan. I mean, in India, I think it was not long ago when our own armed forces says that China has been meeting India with a borrowed knife, and that borrowed knife is actually Pakistan. So when India understands the merit of getting into a tactical rapprochement with an arch rival such as China, owing to geopolitical complexities and the kind of economic dependence that we have in China, we have $125 billion worth of trade, out of which $100 billion is completely our trade deficit. So we continue being reliant on China. When India sees merit in that, now just sort of try and apply the same logic to a strategic partner such as the United States, with whom we have a major technological partnership. We have a thriving defense industry partnership. And there's one data that I'd like to give everybody, which is that just as you see that Russia is sort of falling somewhere, or Russia's, data shows that Russia's exports are diminishing. It now is just about 36%, and I gave you some data. Simultaneously, the rise that you see of the three main powers that have now come to fill in that gap, the three main, there are many, but the three main have been France. Of course, France is a historical partner again, but France, the United States, and Israel, and then followed by a lot of new partners such as Germany, such as Poland, etc., Brazil.
Are you still there, Swasti?
We seem to have lost the connection there.
We seem to have lost that the connection. We'll try and work on that, but it's interesting what Swasti was saying, and the number of and how you sort of caught the mood in the chat. I mean, there's lots of comments coming.
Lots of comments,
thick and fast, and people have their own opinions, and people are angry. I don't know. Are we going to be able to bring Swasti back, or is that something? Is that a line that is?
I've got a couple more comments there that I thought were quite interesting. I wanted to put there to Swasti, which is from Teja Chiravuri. If the US weaponizes trade against India, it loses leverage, trust, and access to the very global South it once hoped to lead. I know you don't like the term.
Yeah, but it's the one term that exists to sort of.
Right.
So I think we need to invent a new term. I don't know if we do this on News Desk
Maybe we can
Live,
put that out
maybe.
as a poll and ask our viewers there. But yeah, but it's true what you're saying. I mean, there are a lot of questions about what can India do. What leverage does India have? So I think that's something that really, and I think the other thing which I've brought up as well, and it seems to come out a lot in this discussion that we're having in general about tariffs, and in general that I have in my day today, which is how does it affect you and me, or just the average person out there? How are they going to see? Are they going to see a price rise? Are they going to have to pay more for whatever product it is? And I think that's what it always boils down to. And I think that seems to come through as well in this discussion when we're doing it.
I mean, what Rahul was saying in terms of how it affects you at an individual level, for example, in India or whatever. I mean, the message just really appears to be it is this drip feed, it's this slow roll of an impact, because a job isn't lost overnight.
No.
Especially when you're having a negotiation on tariff rate. What kind of tariff rate do you want? Is it going to be zero tariff? Is it going to be this high or that low? Which sector? Who is exempt? So there is this drip feed, it would appear, of the impact trickling down slowly based on what is determined. That itself takes some time. So, and that's the same being
pretty
said for the
shocking what he
United
said
States,
there
right?
about the middle class in India, how essentially everyone in the middle class would be affected by this. And I think the other thing about the tariffs, which has really come through for me, is exactly what you're saying, that it's not also immediate, the impact of tariffs. So, for example, in the case of products, say, being bought by suppliers or by big chains or whatever it may be, they'll often put those orders in, which is something that I actually only learned relatively recently, say 6 months to a year in advance, which actually surprised me. I didn't think it was in that much, the time frame was that large, meaning that actually the impact we won't feel perhaps until the end of this year,
Yeah.
the middle of next year, perhaps. And of course, that's then when things might be quite difficult for a lot of countries around the world.
Yeah, and there's also when the political cycle in America might change with the whole midterm election.
Let's not forget about that, of course.
I saw you closed the poll in the
did,
chat.
yeah.
Do you want to give us the results of the
Yeah,
poll? Because
sure.
I always like to know what the results are.
Yeah, it's actually quite one-sided, our result. I will first repeat the question. Should India continue buying oil from Russia? We've got 561 votes. 66% says yes for its national interest. 16% says yes. Western nations do the same. 11% says no to show support for Ukraine, and 5% says no to secure US trade deals. I would say, actually, this is the general atmosphere I get from the chat, actually. Many people think that, like, what Trump or the US is doing is quite unjustified. Like, it's quite unjust for India. Yeah.
And I've just been told that, thanks so much for that, Swasti is back. Swasti, can you hear us? Because the line just went dead and you disappeared. I don't know if you're still back. Can you hear us? Can you see us? No, I believe that line hasn't really worked out. Thanks so much for those poll results. I think it's pretty clear, 66% yes for its national interest. And that appears to be from across the board, right?
Yeah,
It's not just
exactly.
viewers
That's
from
what I've been seeing.
India, we would
Yeah,
imagine.
absolutely.
That was definitely the mood of some of that Swasti also caught on to. Our apologies, there was a problem with the line when it came to Professor Swasti Rao from India, but I hope you enjoyed the insights and the context, the deep context that she provided.
Fantastic context from both our experts
from
this
both
week.
of them as well.
Really.
And Rahul also sort of laying it on the line as to what exactly the economic impact of these tariffs and these penalties could be. That's basically it for this week's discussion on News Desk. We're going to be back again next week.
Next week, of course, and don't forget that around 24 hours before our show, so next... I don't want to say Tuesday, because it may not be Tuesday where you are. We'll say 24 hours before the show, of course, we'll be posting in the community channel what our topic will be and what we'll be discussing in next week's News Desk. And don't forget to go in there, comment, and it's always great to have you sending in your comments and your questions for us.
Thanks, everybody, for joining in. Thanks, Jerry, for moderating the community. And Pablo, it's been a pleasure hosting with you.
Thanks, Barish.
Bye,
You
everybody.
too. Thanks, everybody.